Welcome to the Oracle's Rest, a place where stories unfold slowly, where time softens, and where the mind is free to wander. Tonight, we drift back to ancient Italy, to a people who rose to greatness long before Rome, who taught the Romans how to build and worship and rule, and then slowly vanished into the very empire they had helped to raise, a people whose cities glittered along the hills of central Italy, who reclined at feasts with their wives beside them, who read the future in the livers of sheep and the flight of birds, and who left behind painted tombs, golden treasures, and a written language that to this day we cannot fully read. Tonight, we gather 100 quiet facts about the Etruscans, the lost people who came before Rome. Let them wash over you slowly, one after another, like waves in the dark, as you drift gently towards sleep. We call them the Etruscans, but that is a name that came from others. The Romans called them the Etrusci or the Tusci, and it is from that second name that we get the word Tuscany, the region of Italy where so many of them lived. The Greeks called them the Tyrrhenians, and it is from that name that the Tyrrhenian Sea, the stretch of water off the western coast of Italy, takes its name to this day. But the Etruscans had a name of their own for themselves. In their own tongue, they called themselves, it seems, the Rasenna or the Rasna. And so, the people we know by a borrowed Roman name walked their own hills, answering to a name almost forgotten now, a soft word in a language the world can no longer speak. Their homeland was a region we now call Etruria, spread across the middle of the Italian peninsula, roughly where the modern regions of Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria lie today. It was a land of rolling hills and river valleys and dark forests and a long coastline along the western sea. It was rich country, green and fertile, good for grain and vines and olives, and beneath its hills lay something richer still. For the earth of Etruria was heavy with metal, with copper and iron and tin, and just off its coast lay the little island of Elba, whose hills held some of the richest iron ore in all of Italy. It was this hidden wealth of ore, drawn from the land and the island and worked in Etruscan furnaces, that would help make the Etruscans, for a time, among the most powerful people in all the Mediterranean world. Their story stretches back a very long way into the early Iron Age of Italy, around 3,000 years ago, in their earliest days, in the centuries before they built their great cities. They belonged to what scholars now call the Villanovan culture, named after a place where its remains were first found. These early people cremated their dead and buried the ashes in distinctive pottery urns, and lived in villages of simple huts. And out of that early village world, slowly, over generations, the brilliant civilization of the Etruscans grew, reaching its height around the 7th and 6th centuries, before the Common Era, when their cities were wealthy and their ships crossed the sea, and their influence stretched across much of Italy. Where the Etruscans first came from is one of the oldest mysteries in the study of the ancient world, and people argued about it even in ancient times. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing long ago, told a story that they had come from far away, from Lydia in Asia Minor, sailing west to escape a terrible famine in their homeland, led by a prince named Tyrrhenus. It is a romantic tale of a whole people setting out across the sea to find a new home. But another ancient writer, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, disagreed and argued that the Etruscans had not come from anywhere at all, but had always been in Italy, a native people of the land. For centuries, this question was debated, whether the Etruscans were newcomers from the east or an ancient native people of Italy. And in our own time, the tools of modern science have been brought to bear upon it. Scholars have studied the ancient bones of the Etruscans themselves, reading the faint traces of ancestry written in old DNA. And the answer they have found points, for the most part, toward the second view. The Etruscans appear to have been, in their origins, a local people, closely related to their neighbours in Italy, sharing much of their ancestry with the peoples around them. And yet, their language was utterly unlike the languages of those neighbours, which only deepens the puzzle. A native people, it seems, speaking a tongue from nowhere else on earth. For the language of the Etruscans is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. It was not like the languages around it. The peoples of ancient Italy, and indeed of most of Europe, spoke languages belonging to a great related family we call the Indo-European family. Tongues distantly connected to one another, to Latin and Greek and far away, to the languages of Persia and India, but Etruscan belonged to none of these. It stood alone, unrelated, so far as we can tell, to any other known language in the world, save for a few faint possible cousins long since vanished. It was an isolate, a tongue unto itself, and it has kept much of its secret to this day. And here is a strange and wonderful thing. We can read the Etruscan alphabet. We can sound out their words, but we cannot fully understand them. For the Etruscans borrowed their alphabet from the Greeks, adapting the letters to their own use. And so their writing is not a mystery of unknown symbols. We know what sounds the letters make. We can pronounce an Etruscan inscription aloud. But knowing how to say the words is not the same as knowing what they mean. And because the Etruscan language is related to no living tongue, we have no easy key to its meaning. We are like someone who can read every letter of a book perfectly and yet cannot understand a single sentence. That said, we are not entirely in the dark. Over the years, scholars have slowly puzzled out the meanings of many Etruscan words, especially the ones that appear again and again in the same kinds of places. We know their words for many family relations, for mother and father and son and daughter. We know their numbers, or most of them. The words for 1 through 6, found written out as words upon the faces of a pair of ancient dice, though scholars still argue over which written word belongs to which number, so that even the simple counting of the Etruscans, their 1 and 2 and 3, keeps a little of its mystery to this day. We know many names of gods and titles, and the words that appear on tombs, telling who lies within, and how old they were, and what offices they held in life. Little by little, word by word, the silence of the Etruscan language is being gently broken, though it may never be fully understood. Most of what survives of their writing comes from their tombs. There are many thousands of Etruscan inscriptions known, tens of thousands even, but the great majority of them are short. The brief, formal words carved on graves and urns and offerings. We have far fewer of the things we would most love to have: their stories, their histories, their poems, their laws. Those were written, most likely, on cloth and wax and other perishable things, and they have crumbled away with time The voices of the Etruscans survive mostly as epitaphs, the quiet words that mark the resting places of the dead. But there are a few longer texts, and they are precious. The longest of all is a strange and moving thing. It is a book, written on linen cloth, a sacred text of some kind, filled with ritual instructions, and it survives by the most extraordinary accident. For long after the Etruscans were gone, that linen book was somehow carried to Egypt, and there it was, torn into strips, and those strips were used to wrap a mummy. And so, the longest surviving text in the Etruscan language spent nearly 2,000 years wound around the body of an Egyptian mummy before scholars unrolled it and realized, to their astonishment, what it was. It is called the Linen Book, and it rests now in a museum far from Italy, its ancient words still only partly understood. There are other treasures of Etruscan writing. There are golden tablets, thin sheets of gold inscribed with sacred words. One of them written in both Etruscan and the language of the Phoenicians, which offers scholars a precious clue, a place where the unknown tongue sits beside a known one. There are inscribed tablets of bronze and stone, laying out boundaries and laws and family histories. Each one is a small window, a fragment of a voice, a piece of a people speaking to us across more than 2,000 years. In words we strain to understand. The Etruscans wrote in a way that can look strange to our eyes, for they most often wrote from right to left, the lines running backward across the surface from the way we are. Used to reading, their love of the alphabet reached back to their earliest days, and among their oldest treasures is a small tablet of ivory, made to be written upon with a coating of wax, along the very edge of which is carefully inscribed the whole alphabet, in order, letter by letter, a kind of schoolbook from more than 2,500 years ago, showing how carefully they learned and kept their letters. And though most of what they wrote is lost, a handful of longer inscriptions survive to tease and reward the patient scholar. There are the golden leaves found at a seaside sanctuary, inscribed in both Etruscan and the language of the Phoenicians, recording a gift to a goddess by the ruler of one of their cities. There is a bronze tablet, brought to light only in recent decades, that sets down the details of a sale of land, one of the longest Etruscan texts we possess. There is a great inscribed stone, raised to mark a boundary or settle a dispute between two families. its long lines of law still only partly understood. Each of these is pored over, weighed word against word, in the patient hope of drawing a little more meaning out of the long silence. And though we cannot fully read their language, the Etruscans gave the world a gift through their writing that has lasted to this very day. For when they took the alphabet from the Greeks and reshaped it, they passed it on, in turn, to their neighbours and pupils, the Romans. The letters of the Latin alphabet, the very letters used to write countless languages across the world today, including this one, came to Rome largely by way of the Etruscans. Every time we write, we are using, in a distant way, an alphabet handed down through Etruscan hands. It is one of their quietest and most enduring legacies, hidden in plain sight in every written word. Nor was it only their letters that the Etruscans handed on, the very shapes of the numbers that Rome would use. The marks we still call Roman numerals are thought to have grown in part from Etruscan ways of counting and tallying, another small inheritance passed from the older people to the younger. And the Etruscans were skilled workers of cloth, as well as of metal and clay. They grew flax across their fields and wove it into fine linen, which they used not only for garments and for the sails of their ships, but even for books, for their sacred writings were sometimes set down upon long strips of linen cloth, folded like the pages of a book, of which that one famous survivor carried off in the end to wrap an Egyptian mummy, is the last that remains to us. Cloth and metal, gold and clay, letters and numbers. The Etruscans left their mark upon the most ordinary materials of life, and much of it flowed quietly onward, unnoticed, into the world that came after them. Let us turn now to their cities, for the Etruscans were great builders of cities, among the first true cities in all of Italy. They did not form a single unified kingdom or empire. Instead, they were organized into independent city-states, each with its own rulers and its own character, rather as the Greeks were, and the greatest of these cities were joined together in a loose league, a sacred confederation traditionally said to number 12 cities. This League of 12 was bound more by religion and custom than by politics, and its members would gather each year at a shared holy sanctuary to worship, to hold games, and to take counsel together. The names of these cities still echo through Italy, for many of them survive as towns to this day. There was Veii, the great city nearest to Rome, its rich and powerful rival. There was Tarquinia, famous for its painted tombs, and Salvatore, known in ancient times as Caere, with its vast city of the dead. There was Volci, and Volterra high on its hilltop, and Chiusi, and Arezzo, and Cortona, and Perugia, and the port cities of Populonia and Vetulonia by the sea. Each was a world of its own, with its own workshops and temples and noble families, and together they formed the shifting, quarrelsome, brilliant patchwork of the Etruscan world. The Etruscans did not stay only within their homeland of Etruria. In the days of their strength, they spread outward, north and south, planting their cities and their culture in new lands. To the south, in the rich volcanic country of Campania, near where Naples now stands, they founded and controlled cities, among them Capua, extending their power far down the Italian coast, and to the north, they crossed the Apennine Mountains into the wide valley of the river Po, and there they built fresh cities on the northern plains. One of these, whose remains still survive, was laid out upon a careful grid of streets crossing at right angles, with drains running beneath the roads and blocks, of houses set in neat rows, a planned city of remarkable order for its age, giving us one of the clearest pictures we have of how an Etruscan town was arranged on the far side of Italy, along the shores of the Adriatic. They founded busy trading ports, one of which gave its name, some say, to the Adriatic Sea itself, and in whose graves have been found great quantities of fine Greek pottery, carried there by sea from across the Mediterranean. For a time, the Etruscans held both coasts of Italy at once, the western sea that bore their name, and the eastern sea beyond the mountains, a people whose reach stretched from shore to shore across the whole peninsula. Once a year, the leaders of these cities came together at a sacred place they called the Fanum Voltumnae, the shrine of their great god, Voltumna. There, at this holy meeting ground, whose exact location is still not certainly known today, the Etruscans held a grand festival with religious rites and athletic games and markets. banquets and the gathering of the powerful. It was the closest thing the Etruscans had to a national gathering. A yearly coming together of a people who were otherwise divided into many separate cities. And even there, they met not chiefly to make war or policy, but to worship. For above all things, the Etruscans were a deeply religious people. Indeed, the Romans themselves, who knew them well, considered the Etruscans to be the most religious of all peoples, more devoted to the gods and to ritual than anyone else they knew. The Etruscans believed that the will of the gods was written everywhere, in the world around them, in the sky, in the weather, in the flights of birds and the entrails of animals, and that a person who knew how to read these signs and could learn the intentions of the divine, the whole of their religion was bound up with this art of reading the signs of the gods, an art so distinctive that the Romans gave it a name, the Etruscan discipline. The most famous of these arts of divination was the reading of livers. When an animal was sacrificed, a specially trained Etruscan priest called a haruspex would examine its liver, studying its shape and its markings and its every blemish, believing that the state of the liver revealed the mind of the gods. The liver was thought of as a kind of map of the heavens, divided into regions, each belonging to a different god, so that a mark in one part meant one thing, and a mark in another meant something else entirely. A remarkable object survives that shows just how detailed this art was. A life-sized model of a sheep's liver, cast in bronze, its surface divided into many small sections, each inscribed with the name of a god. It was, in effect, a priest's map for reading the divine will in the flesh of a sacrifice. The Etruscans read the gods in other ways too. They watched the flight of birds and their calls and the direction from which they came, believing these to carry meaning. They studied lightning with special care, dividing the sky into regions and noting from which quarter a bolt had come and where it had struck. For a thunderbolt was a message from the gods, and its meaning depended on where in the heavens it was born. This careful watching of the sky, this marking out of the heavens into sacred regions, would pass to the Romans and shape their own religion deeply. All of this sacred knowledge the Etruscans believed had been given to them by divine teachers in the distant past. They told of a wondrous child called Tejas, who had risen up out of a freshly ploughed field, an infant with the wisdom of an old man, and who taught the first Etruscans the whole art of divination before he died. They told also of a prophetic nymph named Virgoia, who revealed sacred truths about the land and the boundaries between things. From these divine figures, the Etruscans said, came their holy books, their written law of how to read the livers and the lightning, and the proper rituals for every occasion. A whole library of sacred instruction that the Romans called the Etruscan discipline. The gods of the Etruscans were many, and some of them we can match to the gods of Greece and Rome. Their chief god was Tinia, the great sky god and hurler of thunderbolts, whom the Romans knew as Jupiter. Beside him stood the goddess Uni, his queen, whom the Romans called Juno, and the wise goddess Minerva, from whose name comes the Roman Minerva. These three were honored together as a great divine triad. And this idea of three chief gods worshipped together would pass to Rome, where Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva were honored side by side on the Capitoline Hill. But the Etruscans had many other gods besides. There was Turan, goddess of love and beauty, akin to Venus. There was Fuflens, the joyful god of wine and revelry, like the Greek Dionysus. There was Nethans, god of water and the sea, whose name echoes in the Roman Neptune. There was Sethlans, the smith god of fire and the forge, and Terms, the swift messenger, and Aeta, the grim lord of the underworld. And presiding over the sacred league of cities was Voltumna, whom some later called the chief god of all the Etruscans, at whose shrine the 12 cities gathered each year. Beyond these great gods, the Etruscans honored a whole host of others, deities of every corner of life and of the world. There was Laran, a god of war, and Usil, a god of the sun, and Tiva, of the moon, and Selvans, who watched over the woods and the wild places, and many more besides, some of whose names appear only once or twice, and whose natures we can now barely guess. Their sacred lore was gathered into different kinds of holy books, one set concerned with the reading of livers, another with the meaning of lightning and thunder, another with the proper performance of rituals, the founding of cities, and the laying out of sacred ground to mark out a sacred space, whether a patch of sky to be watched for omens or a piece of earth to raise a temple upon. The Etruscans had a formal art of dividing and consecrating it, and from their practice for such a marked off holy space would come, in time, the Roman idea, and even the very word for a temple. They watched, too, for prodigies, for strange and unnatural happenings, a rain of stones, a beast born misshapen, a statue that seemed to move or to weep, believing that such wonders were urgent messages from the gods, which must be read rightly and answered with the proper rites. The Etruscans thought deeply about death and the world beyond it, and here their beliefs took on a darker cast as the centuries passed. In their vision of the afterlife, there moved strange and fearsome beings, demons of death who escorted the souls of the dead into the world below. There was Charon, a blue-skinned demon with a great hammer, who is not quite the same as the Greek ferryman of similar name, and Vanth, a winged female spirit, often shown with wings and torches, who accompanied the dying. These figures appear again and again in the later art of the tombs, watching over the passage from this world to the next, a reminder that for all their love of life, the Etruscans held the world of the dead in solemn awe, and it is in their tombs, above all, that the Etruscans still speak to us most vividly, for they buried their dead with extraordinary care, and built for them cities of the dead, as grand as the cities of the living. Near their towns they laid out vast burial grounds, necropolises, which is a Greek word meaning simply city of the dead. And these were not scattered graves, but planned places, with streets and squares and rows of tombs, laid out like the towns of the living. The greatest of these cities of the dead can still be walked through today at Cerveteri, the ancient Caire. There is a huge necropolis where the tombs were built, as great round mounds of earth called tumuli, raised over stone chambers cut into the soft rock below. Walking there is like walking through a silent town, with lanes running between the grassy mounds, each one covering the resting place of a family. At Tarquinia, another great necropolis, holds the most famous treasures of all, the painted tombs, whose walls still glow with colour after more than 2,000 years in the dark. The tombs of the Etruscans took many forms across their long history and their many cities. In some places they cut their tombs into the soft rock as chambers made, to resemble the rooms of a house, with ceilings carved to imitate the wooden beams of a roof, and doorways and benches, so that the dead might rest in a home much like the one they had left. In one famous tomb, the walls are carved and moulded with images of household things, of tools and cups and helmets, and even a coil of rope, all the ordinary objects of a life, sculpted in relief, so that the dead might have the familiar comforts of home about them still. In other places, the Etruscans carved the fronts of their tombs into the faces of cliffs, cutting great temple-like facades into the living rock, so that whole hillsides became rows of stone doorways to the dead. And in the soft volcanic stone of certain regions, they cut deep, narrow roads, sunken far below the level of the land, their walls rising sheer on either side, passages whose full purpose is still debated, winding between the towns and the tombs like grooves worn deep into the earth. To wander these places today is to move through a landscape shaped above and below the ground by a people forever mindful of their dead. For the Etruscans painted the inner walls of their finest tombs with scenes full of life and colour, and these paintings are among the most precious things they left behind, for they show us the Etruscans as they wish to be seen, and give us glimpses of a world otherwise lost. Many of the tombs are named for what is painted within them. There is a tomb of the leopards, where two great spotted cats look down from above a scene of feasting. There is a tomb of hunting and fishing, where small figures cast their nets and hurl at birds beneath a bright sky full of wheeling flocks. There is a tomb of the bulls, and a tomb of the augurs, and many more, each a small painted room sealed in the earth, holding its bright images through the long centuries. And what do these paintings show? Above all, they show joy. They show banquets, with men and women reclining together on couches, cups in hand, wreaths on their heads. They show musicians playing the double pipe and the lyre, and dancers moving with their arms raised, and servants bringing food and wine. They show games and hunting and the pleasures of the table and the field. In these early tombs, the afterlife is imagined not as a place of gloom, but as an eternal feast, a banquet without end, where the joys of life continue forever. The Etruscans, it seems, hoped to carry the pleasures of this world into the next. They kept the remains of their dead in vessels of great care and beauty. In their earlier days, in some of their cities, they placed the ashes in urns whose lids were shaped like human heads, giving the vessel something of the face of the person within, so that the urn itself became a kind of portrait. In later centuries, they carved cinerary chests of stone and clay, upon whose lids reclined small sculpted figures of the dead, propped on one elbow as though at a banquet, while the sides of the chest were carved with scenes from myth, or with the long journey to the world below. And as the centuries passed, the mood of the tombs slowly darkened. The bright, endless feasts of the early paintings gave way, in later tombs, to gloomier visions, to processions of the dead led by demons, to the grim lords of the underworld, to fearsome spirits with beaks and snakes and cruel hammers. Yet even in these darker chambers there is beauty, such as the tender painted portrait in one famous tomb of a lovely woman shown in profile, her features so delicately rendered that she seems almost to breathe. A real face, gazing quietly out of the painted dark across all the long centuries between. One of the most beautiful and famous of all Etruscan works comes from this world of the funeral banquet. It is a large sculpture made of terracotta of a husband and wife reclining together upon a couch, as if at a feast. They lean upon cushions, close together, the man's arm around the woman's shoulders, and both of them smile a soft, gentle, mysterious smile. It is called the sarcophagus of the spouses, and it once held the ashes of the couple it portrays. There is something deeply touching about it, this image of a man and woman, dead for 25 centuries, still reclining side by side, still smiling, still together at their eternal banquet. That gentle smile upon their faces is something scholars have noticed on much Etruscan sculpture, a faint, calm, knowing smile that seems to play about the lips of their statues. It is sometimes called the archaic smile, and it appears on figures from this early age not only among the Etruscans, but among the Greeks as well. But on Etruscan faces, it seems to have a particular warmth, a serenity, as though these long dead people knew some quiet secret and were content. The reclining couple on that sarcophagus points us to something remarkable about the Etruscans, something that startled and even scandalized the Greeks and Romans who observed it. For among the Etruscans, women held a place of freedom and honor that was almost unknown elsewhere in the ancient world. Etruscan women reclined at banquets beside their husbands, sharing in the feasting and the wine, appearing openly in public in a way that Greek women never did. To the Greeks, who kept their own women secluded and apart, this was shocking, and some of them wrote scandalized accounts of Etruscan women, misunderstanding their freedom as a kind of looseness. But the truth appears to be that Etruscan women enjoyed a genuinely high status. They could own property in their own right. They attended banquets and public games. They seemed to have been literate, able to read and write, and in a striking mark of their standing, Etruscan inscriptions often record not only a person's father's name, but also their mother's, a recognition of the mother's line that was highly unusual in the ancient world, in a time and a region where women were so often hidden away. The women of Etruria dined openly, owned their own goods, kept their own names, and passed their names to their children. Let us linger a while in the world of the Etruscan banquet, for it was clearly one of the great pleasures of their lives, painted again and again upon their tomb walls. They reclined to dine in the manner that would later be adopted by the Romans, stretched out on couches rather than seated. They drank wine, for which they were famous, growing vines across their hills and trading their wine far and wide. They wore garlands and fine clothes, and their feasts were filled with music, for the Etruscans loved music perhaps more than almost any people of their age. The instrument they loved above all was the double pipe, a kind of two-reeded flute played by blowing into both pipes at once, filling the air with a bright, reedy, haunting sound. So beloved was music among the Etruscans that ancient writers claimed they did almost everything to its accompaniment. There is an old report that the Etruscans would box, to the music of the pipes, and knead their bread to music, and even hunt to music, setting their nets and snares to the sound of the flute, so that the very animals, it was said, were charmed toward the trap. Whether or not that last tale is quite true, it captures something real. A people who wove music through the whole fabric of their days. The Greeks who wrote of the Etruscans marveled and sometimes sneered at what seemed to them a life of luxury and ease. They told that the Etruscans set rich tables not once, but twice a day, spread with fine food and covered with embroidered cloths, and drank deeply and lived softly in a comfort that stricter peoples found scandalous. Whether this was the whole truth, or partly the envy and disapproval of poorer neighbours, we cannot fully say, but it fits well enough with the joyful feasting painted upon their tomb walls. In those paintings, following an old custom of the ancient world, the men are shown with skin of a deep reddish brown, and the women with skin of pale ivory, so that the two are easy to tell apart across the crowded scenes of the banquet. They are handsome, well-fed, garlanded figures at their ease upon their couches, and they seem, across all the long centuries, to be thoroughly enjoying themselves. A people who plainly loved the good things of life and saw no reason at all to be ashamed of it. They loved games and spectacle as well. Their tomb paintings and other art show us chariot races and wrestling and boxing and running and all manner of athletic contests, often held as part of the solemn games that honoured the dead. Among the strangest figures to appear in these scenes is a masked man they called Versu, shown wearing a mask and a pointed hat, sometimes setting a savage dog upon a hooded and half-blinded opponent in a kind of grim and bloody game. Some scholars believe that from such Etruscan funeral games, held to honour the dead with contests and bloodshed, there may have grown, in time, the gladiatorial games of Rome, and there are those who think that the very word for a mask, and later for a character or a person, may descend from the name of that masked Etruscan figure, Versu. The funeral games the Etruscans held to honour their dead were grand and varied. Their tomb paintings show us chariots thundering around the turning post, and riders upon horseback, and wrestlers locked together, and boxers with their fists bound, and runners and acrobats and dancers, all performing before crowds seated upon wooden stands. Horses were prized and beloved, bred for the chariot and the race, and the swift beauty of a galloping horse appears again and again in Etruscan art. These games, held with such splendor beside the graves of the great, were among the many Etruscan customs that Rome would take up and make its own, filling its own long calendar in the ages to come, with races and contests and shows. We can even glimpse how the Etruscans dressed from their paintings and their statues. The wealthy wore fine garments of wool and linen, brightly coloured, and over them a rounded cloak draped across the body, which was the direct ancestor of the Roman toga, that most Roman of garments, worn first upon Etruscan shoulders. On their feet they often wore shoes, with pointed toes that curled upward at the tip, a fashion much like that of the peoples of the East. Their women arranged their hair in careful styles, sometimes gathered up beneath a tall pointed cap, and adorned themselves with the delicate gold jewellery at which their craftsmen so excelled. And in one small but telling matter, the Etruscans shaped the very way that people would be named for centuries after them, for they used a system of names in which a person carried both their own given name and the name of their family or clan. This idea of the shared family name, handed down among kin, was taken up by the Romans, and it lies at the root of the way that families across much of the world still name themselves. To this day, another quiet Etruscan gift woven invisibly into ordinary life. For the Etruscans, we must remember, were not only a people of feasts and tombs and priests, they were also a people of great practical genius, master builders and engineers whose skills the Romans would inherit and carry to glory. The Etruscans were superb workers of metal, drawing iron and copper from their hills and the island of Elba, whose rich iron ore was smelted in great quantities at the coastal city of Populonia, where the ancient slag heaps can still be seen. This mastery of metal was the foundation of their wealth and their trade. They were skilled, too, in the management of water, in draining marshes and digging tunnels and channeling streams. Across Etruria, they cut networks of underground drainage channels, called cuniculi, to control the flow of water, to drain wet land and make it good for farming, and to keep their cities from flooding. This Etruscan skill in hydraulic engineering was famous, and when Etruscan kings ruled the young city of Rome, it was they who first drained its swampy valleys, digging the great drain that would become the Cloaca Maxima, the mighty sewer that still runs beneath Rome to this day. The Etruscans understood the arch, that most important of architectural forms, in which wedge-shaped stones lean together to span an opening and bear great weight. Some of their city gates, built of stone arches, still stand after more than 2,000 years, such as the great arched gateways at Volterra and Perugia. This knowledge of the arch, this ability to build strong and lasting spans of stone, would be taken up by the Romans and raised to magnificence in their bridges and aqueducts and triumphal arches. But its roots reached back, in part, to the Etruscans. They planned their cities with care, sometimes laying them out on a grid of streets crossing at right angles, and they surrounded them with mighty walls of stone. They founded their cities with solemn religious rites, marking out the sacred boundary of the town with a plough, and consecrating the space of the city to the gods. All of these practices, the grid, the wall, the sacred boundary, the founding rites, would pass to Rome, so that even the way the Romans laid out and blessed their towns bore the deep imprint of Etruscan custom. Their temples, too, had a distinctive form. Etruscan temples were built with wooden frames and walls of mud brick, set upon a high stone platform, with a deep porch of columns in front, and a great overhanging roof. Because the buildings themselves were made largely of perishable materials, little of them survives, but they were adorned with magnificent sculptures of painted terracotta, gods and heroes modelled in clay and fired, and painted in bright colours, which stood upon the rooftops and filled the gables. This Etruscan style of temple would give rise to what later builders called the Tuscan order, one of the classical forms of architecture named for the land of the Etruscans. The finest of their terracotta sculptors could work wonders in clay. From the city of Var comes one of the masterpieces of all Etruscan art, a great striding statue of the god Apullu, the Etruscan Apollo, made to stand upon a temple roof. It shows the god in motion, stepping forward with a mysterious smile, his drapery flowing, alive with energy and grace. It is thought to be the work of a master sculptor named Vulca, one of the very few Etruscan artists whose name has come down to us, remembered because his fame was so great that he was called even to Rome to adorn its greatest temple. The Etruscans worked marvels in bronze as well as in clay. Among the most famous of all Etruscan bronzes is a fierce and beautiful statue of the Chimera, the monster of myth with the body of a lion, a second head of a goat rising from its back, and a serpent for a tail, found near the city of Arezzo. It snarls and coils with astonishing life, wounded and furious. One of the great animal sculptures of the ancient world. There is also a solemn bronze figure known as the orator, shown in the act of speaking with his arm raised, dressed in a Roman-style toga, an image from the very end of the Etruscan world, when its people were already becoming Roman. And there is one bronze so famous that many who have never heard of the Etruscans know it well. The great she-wolf, the wolf who suckles the twin infants Romulus and Remus in the founding legend of Rome. For a very long time, this wolf was believed to be an Etruscan work made by Etruscan hands. And though scholars now argue about exactly when it was cast, the wolf remains bound up with the deep and tangled relationship between the Etruscans and the Romans, the older people and the younger, the teachers and the pupils. The Etruscans were also exquisite workers of gold, and their jewelry is among the most delicate ever made in the ancient world. They mastered a technique called granulation, in which tiny grains of gold, some almost too small to see, are fused onto a surface to make patterns of astonishing fineness. Etruscan goldsmiths could cover a brooch or an earring with thousands upon thousands of these minute golden beads, arranged in intricate designs, a skill so refined that later craftsmen struggled for centuries to rediscover how it was done. The tombs of their wealthy dead held earrings and necklaces and brooches and diadems of this shimmering gold work, treasures fit for a people who loved beauty and display. They made beautiful bronze mirrors as well, polished on one side to give a reflection, and engraved on the other with scenes from myth and daily life, often with the names of the figures written beside them. These engraved mirrors are one of the richest sources we have for Etruscan mythology and belief, for through them we learn the Etruscan names of gods and heroes, and see the stories they loved to tell. A woman of Etruria might hold such a mirror to arrange her hair, and on its back would be a scene of gods and heroes, labelled in her own tongue. The Etruscans also left behind countless small figures of bronze, offered as gifts to the gods at their shrines, where they were dedicated in their thousands. Little images of worshippers and warriors and gods, each one a small prayer cast in metal. Among the strangest and most striking of these is a slender figure of a boy, cast so long and thin and stretched that he looks almost like a shadow thrown across the ground by the low evening sun, and indeed a poetic name meaning the shadow of the evening was long afterward given to him. He stands there, elongated and serene, one of the most haunting little sculptures to survive from the whole ancient world. The Etruscans adorned the edges of their roofs, too, with faces moulded in terracotta and brightly painted. The fierce, grinning masks of monsters and the smiling faces of gods and revelers, gazing down from the eaves of their temples and their homes. And there is one more art, humble and human, in which the Etruscans were pioneers, for they were among the earliest dentists known to history. Etruscan craftsmen made dental appliances of gold, bands and bridges of gold wire that could hold false teeth in place, replacing teeth that had been lost. Some of these ancient golden dental works survive, found in the mouths of the long dead, a startling reminder that these people, so distant from us in time, worried over the same small human troubles that we do, and found clever and careful ways to mend them. The skill of the Etruscans in bronze went far beyond their statues. They made splendid chariots, sheathed in worked bronze and covered with reliefs of gods and heroes, made for parade and ceremony, and one such chariot survives, so richly decorated that it is counted today among the treasures of a great museum far across the sea. They made tall bronze lampstands and incense burners and three-legged stands and countless vessels, so finely wrought that they were prized and traded across the ancient world in war. The Etruscans were formidable, and in their earlier days they came to fight in the manner of the Greeks, in ranks of heavily armoured spearmen with round shields and crested bronze helmets, standing shoulder to shoulder in a wall of shields. Before that, in the days of their kings and nobles, they had ridden to battle in chariots, and horses and horsemanship were always dear to them. A near life-sized bronze figure of a warrior survives from the later days of their world, standing calm in his armor as if about to pour an offering before battle. A quiet and dignified image of an Etruscan soldier at his prayers. And a bronze helmet has even been found far to the north, beyond the Alps, scratched with an inscription in Etruscan letters, carried who knows how far from the land where it was first made. Much of the beautiful pottery found in Etruscan tombs was not, in fact, made by the Etruscans at all, but was imported from Greece. For the Etruscans were great admirers and collectors of Greek painted vases. So eager were they for these Greek pots, and so carefully did they bury them in their tombs, that today many of the finest surviving Greek vases in all the world's museums were actually dug up from the ground of Etruria, preserved for us by Etruscan hands that treasured them and laid them to rest underground. In a strange twist, we owe much of what survives of Greek vase painting to the Etruscan love of beautiful things. The Etruscans made splendid pottery of their own as well, and one kind in particular is uniquely theirs. It is called bucchero, a fine pottery fired in a way that turned it a deep, glossy black all the way through, often polished until it shone almost like metal. Cups and jugs and bowls of black bucchero, sometimes decorated with delicate designs, were a signature of the Etruscan potter's art, elegant and dark and unmistakable. Now, the Etruscans did not keep to their own hills. They were a seafaring people, and their ships ranged across the Western Mediterranean, trading and raiding and carrying their goods to distant shores. They traded with the Greeks and the Phoenicians and the Carthaginians and the peoples of Gaul and Spain and beyond. Etruscan bronze vessels, their fine metalwork, and their wine travelled far, and Etruscan flagons of bronze have been found in the graves of Celtic chieftains north of the Alps, carried there along the long trade roads of ancient Europe. The wealth of the Etruscans flowed above all from this trade and from the metal in their hills. The coastal city of Populonia, almost the only great Etruscan city built right upon the shore, grew rich, smelting iron brought from a nearby island, and so much waste was left from its furnaces that great heaps of dark slag remain along its shore even now. From their ports, the Etruscans shipped their wine in tall clay jars across the sea, and their wine was so prized among the peoples to the north and the west that Etruscan wine jars have been dug up in great numbers far away in the land of Gaul, and the wrecks of Etruscan ships have been found upon the sea floor, still laden with hundreds of jars that never reached their harbour. At their own port towns, Greek merchants settled and built their shrines, living and trading alongside the Etruscans, so that these harbours became meeting places of peoples, where the goods and gods and ideas of the whole Mediterranean flowed together upon the docks to the Greeks. However, the Etruscans on the sea were not only traders, but also pirates, feared raiders who preyed upon shipping in the Tyrrhenian waters. This reputation was so strong that it even entered Greek myth. There is an old story, sung in an ancient hymn, of how the god of wine, Dionysus, was once seized by Tyrrhenian pirates who did not know he was a god and meant to sell him into slavery. But the god worked wonders upon the ship, causing vines to sprout from the deck and wine to flow and the shape of a great beast to appear, until the terrified pirates leapt overboard into the sea. And as they fell, they were transformed into dolphins. And this, the Greeks said, was why dolphins were once men. The pirate crew of a ship that had dared to lay hands upon a god. The power of the Etruscans upon the sea brought them into conflict with the Greeks, who were spreading their own colonies across the Mediterranean. Around the middle of the 6th century, before the Common Era, the Etruscans joined with the Carthaginians to fight a great sea battle against Greek settlers near the island of Corsica, a battle in the waters off a place called Alalia. The Etruscans and their allies drove the Greeks from those waters, though at heavy cost. And for a time, the Etruscans held sway over the sea. That still bears their name. At the height of their power, Etruscan influence reached north into the valley of the Po and south into the rich lands of Campania, near where Naples stands today. But the height of a people's power is often the beginning of its long decline. And so it was with the Etruscans. Their fortunes turned, slowly at first, and then more swiftly, as new powers rose around them. To the south, the Greek cities grew stronger, and in a great sea battle near Cumae, early in the 5th century before the Common Era. The fleet of the Etruscans was crushed by the Greeks of Syracuse, breaking their power upon the southern seas. From the north came another threat, for over the Alps poured the Celts, the Gauls, fierce warrior peoples who swept down into the valley of the Po and overran the Etruscan cities there, driving the Etruscans from the rich northern lands they had settled. And these same Gauls pressed on southward and even fell upon Rome itself and sacked it. A disaster that shook all of central Italy, caught between the Greeks by sea and the Gauls by land. The Etruscan cities, never fully united, began to weaken, and in their very midst, upon the banks of the river Tiber, there had grown up a young and hungry city that would in the end swallow them all. That city was Rome. And here we come to the deepest and strangest part of the Etruscan story. For the relationship between the Etruscans and the Romans was not simply one of enemies. In its early days, Rome was profoundly shaped by the Etruscans, so much so that some of Rome's own early kings were Etruscans, and much of what became distinctively Roman was learned first from Etruscan teachers. According to Roman tradition, the last kings of Rome, before it became a republic, were of Etruscan blood, a line called the Tarquins. There was Tarquinius Priscus, said to have come to Rome from the Etruscan city of Tarquinia, and after him Servius Tullius, and last of all Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, whose overthrow, the Romans said, ended the age of kings and gave birth to the Roman Republic. Whether every detail of these old stories is true or not, they preserve a real memory that, in its formative years, Rome lay under Etruscan influence and even Etruscan rule. Even after the Romans drove out their Etruscan kings, the Etruscans did not at once loosen their grip upon Rome. Roman legend told of a mighty Etruscan king, Lars Porsena, of the city of Clusium, who marched upon Rome soon after the kings were expelled and laid siege to it, and very nearly took it. And it was against his army, the old story said, that the hero Horatius held the narrow bridge across the Tiber alone, while the Romans hacked it down behind him. Whether Porsena took the city or spared it, the ancient tales disagree, but the memory endured of a time when a great Etruscan king had held Rome in the palm of his hand, and when the Romans told the story of their own distant founding, of Aeneas come from fallen Troy, they gave him an Etruscan enemy too, a proud and godless Etruscan king named Mezentius, so that even in the legends of Rome's beginnings, the Etruscans stand there at the edge, powerful and near, the great neighbours with whom the fate of Rome was forever entwined. And the Romans took a great deal from the Etruscans, more perhaps than they always like to admit. They took, as we have seen, much of their religion, their arts of divination, their reading of livers and lightning and the flight of birds, the marking out of sacred space in the sky and on the ground. The Roman priests who watched the birds for omens, the augurs, practiced an art with deep Etruscan roots. Even the Roman way of founding a city, with a plough drawing the sacred boundary, came down from Etruscan custom. They took symbols of power. 2. The fasces, that bundle of wooden rods bound around an axe, which Roman officials carried before them as a sign of their authority to punish and to rule, was an Etruscan emblem before it was a Roman one. So too, it is thought, were the special robes of Roman magistrates, the toga bordered with purple worn by high officials and by boys, and the ivory chair of office upon which the great men of Rome sat in judgment, the very trappings of Roman power, the robes and rods and chairs of authority, were in large part an Etruscan inheritance. Even the Roman triumph, that grand parade in which a victorious general rode through the city in a chariot, his face painted red, crowned with laurel, may have had its origins in Etruscan ceremony, and the bloody spectacle of the gladiators, which would one day fill the great amphitheatres of Rome, seems to have grown, as we have seen, from Etruscan funeral games. Wherever we look at the customs of early Rome, we find the fingerprints of the Etruscans, the older people whose ways the younger people absorbed and made their own. The debt of Rome to the Etruscans reached even into the world of the stage. For an old account tells that when a plague once fell upon early Rome, the Romans sent for performers out of Etruria, dancers who moved to the music of the pipe, hoping by such shows to soften the anger of the gods, and that from these Etruscan performers grew, in time, the whole tradition of the Roman theatre. The very Latin word for an actor is thought to come down from an Etruscan word, one more Etruscan seed buried quietly in the Latin tongue. And the Etruscans did not only shape Rome's customs, they remembered in their own way their own tangled dealings with the young city on the Tiber. Upon the painted wall of one great tomb there survives a scene from Etruscan history or legend. A band of Etruscan heroes, each named in Etruscan letters beside his figure, freeing a captured comrade and striking down their enemies. And among those enemies is a man whose name marks him as belonging to Rome. It is a rare and precious thing, this glimpse of the Etruscans telling their own story, of their struggles with Rome, painted upon the wall of a tomb, from the side of that history which Rome's own writers never chose to record. One of these very heroes, some believed, went on to rule in Rome itself as one of its kings. So tangled were the fates of the two peoples in those early days. The Etruscans struck coins as well, among the earliest peoples of Italy to do so, minting money of silver and bronze and gold, some of it stamped with the fearsome face of a Gorgon, or with the heads of gods, or with the tools of their metalworking trade. In their society, a wealthy and powerful aristocracy of noble families ruled over a great mass of poorer folk, servants and dependents, who worked their lands and their mines. A division between the great houses and the common people that would trouble the Etruscan cities with unrest in their later days. In their earliest times, these cities had been ruled by kings, much as Rome was, and the trappings of Etruscan kingship, the throne, the scepter, the purple robe, the bundled rods, were the very ones that Rome would borrow. But over time, many Etruscan cities set their kings aside and came instead to be governed by elected magistrates, chief officials chosen for a term to lead the city, a change much like the one that turned Rome from a kingdom into a republic. And when the greatest temple of Rome, the temple upon the Capitoline Hill sacred to Jupiter and Juno and Minerva, was to be built and adorned, it was to an Etruscan master that the Romans turned, the famed sculptor of Veii, who made for them the great image of the god in painted clay, and set upon the temple's roof a chariot of terracotta, so that the very holiest temple of Rome was crowned by the work of Etruscan hands. Yet for all that Rome owed to the Etruscans, in the end, Rome conquered them, city by city, over long years. The Romans extended their power across Etruria. A great turning point came with the fall of Veii, the Etruscan city nearest to Rome and its ancient rival. After a long war, tradition says a siege of 10 years, the Romans at last took Veii. Early in the 4th century, before the Common Era, and destroyed it, absorbing its lands and its people. The nearest and greatest of the Etruscan cities had fallen, and the others, one by one, would follow.